This is phase 1 for resting membrane potential. So inside the cell is more polarized, meaning it's more negative because of the anions, because since they are too large and negatively charged, they cannot leave the cell membrane, making the cell membrane at negative 70 millivolts. And then also potassium is leaving the cell membrane, so that makes the cell membrane more negative. Also, the sodium-potassium pump is used to reestablish the resting ion concentration gradient. So the Na inside are going to move outside of the cell, while the potassium outside the cell are going to move inside the cell to reestablish the resting membrane potential. And this is done through ATP. ATP acts as the stimulus for the sodium-potassium pump. And then so since there are more sodium outside of the cell and then there's more potassium inside the cell, that is the concentration gradient, and it moves from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And the electrical gradient is when there's more negatively charged particles inside the cell membrane and then more positive ones outside of the cell membrane. So the passive leakage channel is always open, allowing the chemical and electrical gradients to flow freely inside and outside the cell membrane. So the Na are going to be moving inside of the cell while the K is moving outside of the cell. So this is phase 2 of action potential. So the voltage gated channels open and close in response to the changes in the membrane potential. So first it starts at the resting state in where the sodium and the potassium channels are closed, leaving the resting membrane potential to be negative 70 millivolts. And then depolarization phase occurs when the sodium channel is open but the potassium channel is closed, causing an influx of sodium into the cell membrane, causing it to be more positive. And this depolarization reaches to positive 30 millivolts. But in order for an action potential to occur, it has to meet the threshold of negative 55 millivolts. And then it reaches the absolute refractory period, where it's the time when an action potential gets generated, so it can be used for the relative refractory period, but no action potential can occur when it reaches this period. And then once it gets the relative refractory period, it goes to the repolarization phase, where the sodium channel is closed but the potassium channel is open, causing an efflux of potassium outside of the cell membrane, causing it to reach the negative 70 millivolts at resting membrane potential. And then hyperpolarization occurs when the potassium channel is still open, causing the cell membrane to be more negative, and the potassium particles are leaving, so there is an efflux of potassium. The two variables that affect conduction of velocity are the axon diameter, and that varies in diameter, and the larger the axon's diameter, the faster it conducts impulses. And then the second one is degree of myelination, and this happens when the presence of a myelin sheath increases the rate of impulse propagation. And then lastly, the saltatory conduction is where action potentials are triggered only at the nodes. Phase 3 is the synapse, and this starts when calcium channels open in the presynaptic axon terminal, and then the calcium rushes into the presynaptic axon terminal. And then the synaptic vessels fuse with the axon membrane and empty the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, and then the neuron, Phase 3 is the synapse. So it starts when calcium channels in the presynaptic axon terminal open, and it allows the calcium to rush into the presynaptic axon terminal. This is where the synaptic vesicles fuse with the axon membrane and empty the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. And then this is where the neuron transmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft. This is where the neuron transmitter binds the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, and then it goes to the ion channels where it opens in the postsynaptic membrane, and the ions rush into the postsynaptic cell, and then the neuron transmitters are terminated. Lastly, exocytosis is a mechanism by which substances are moved from the cell interior to the extracellular space as a secretory vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane.